Mia's latest drawing lay on the chair, a child's sun and a big daisy floating over two stick figures holding hands. Elias smoothed it with his thumb, as if straightening the creases in his own resolve. Before they left, a hospital social worker, the kind who kept a clipboard like a steady compass, asked routine questions about insurance and primary care. Elias answered in the slow, deliberate way of someone who knew how precarious every line on a form could be. He worked nights at the hospital as janitorial staff, took what shifts he could to keep Mia's daycare and the rent paid, and the social worker's eyes narrowed in that automatic way that tries to measure dignity in credit cards and pay stubs. Elias watched the nurse tuck the crayon drawing into his jacket. Mia gripped his finger and whispered, "Daisy, Daddy," as her eyelids drooped. He bent to kiss her forehead. The scent of her hair, shampoo, and something faintly sweet, like fruit, steadied him. Stay with us until the end, subscribe, and tap the bell if you want more stories like this. They discharged Mia late that evening with a home nebulizer and instructions to keep her away from the smog-heavy street while the city's winter pushed its gray fingers through the block. Outside, the sky had the thin, exhausted light of a lamp. Elias carried Mia in the crook of his arm, the hospital corridor fading behind them into a long, ordinary night of 2 beds, bills, and the ritual of getting by. He walked with his shoulders squared, because the world liked its heroes silent and practical. At the building's stoop, a neighbor, Mrs. Gable, leaned on her cane and nodded with the assimilated concern of someone who had once been young. "Keep her warm," Mrs. Gable said. She handed Elias a paper cup of broth she'd kept warm in a thermos. "You're doing good, boy." Her voice was cracked, but the smile was firm and honest. Elias accepted the cup like a benediction, the warmth that moved through his gloves all the way to his bones. 2 days after the emergency, an envelope arrived at the hospital, addressed to the Transplant Coordination Office. The letters were typed, precise and anonymous, a test attached, indicating a match. The paperwork carried a tone of bureaucratic coldness, and, after the necessary forms were processed, the name stamped on the surgery board: Harper Conincad, CEO. She was a public figure by reputation alone, the woman who spoke in decisive, clipped sentences at shareholder meetings, who had, in the world beyond hospital walls, made decisions that rippled through markets and people's livelihoods. Harper's name had appeared in headlines for philanthropic gifts and harder, more cutting stories about layoffs that had followed corporate consolidations. Her private illness had not been public until the medical file made it departmental necessity. Harper woke slowly in the private recovery room, the whole hospital a muffled, soft-edged place beyond the gauze of anesthesia. Machines measured the currency of her breath, and the beeps kept a regular, matter-of-fact tally. Her hand found the rail of the bed as if it were a lifeline, and someone pressed a cool cloth to her forehead. There was the residual salt of surgery at the mouth of the world, the sticky taste of antiseptic and mint candy. The room was a high-floor suite of neutral tones and quiet art, the city visible through a band of glass that showed lights like disembodied stars. For the first time in a long while, Harper felt small and entirely dependent. Her mind, usually a ledger of strategy and outcomes, skewed toward simple things. The sound of her sister's voice earlier, a text that had arrived before the operation, "Call me when you can," and then nothing. The nothing that made the space between heartbeat and breath into a canyon. She remembered the clinical voice that had told her a donor had stepped forward without revealing a name. She tried to conjure an image of that person and kept arriving at the blankness of the unknown. Her recovery was slow and punctuated by the small kindnesses of the staff. A nurse who replaced the ice chips with a smile. A resident who offered a joke about the hospital's coffee. Harper watched them move like a spectator who had long been in the arena and now found the stands unfamiliar. The daisy motif came to her first, as a child's drawing taped clumsily to the bouquet of flowers someone had left at the foot of her bed. A single, small card with a child's handwriting that spelled her name incorrectly and drew a big, cheerful daisy. Whoever had left it had not signed it. The anonymous match set off questions in rooms with expensive chairs. At the corporate office, Beckett Rao, who sat on the board like a winter wind, frowned at a brief that arrived one gray morning. Beckett read possibilities like a man reading an opponent's tells. Donor, anonymous. Donor, hospital janitorial staff? The notion was a lever. Beckett smelled a leak of good press, or, better yet, a vulnerability to exploit. An optics problem turned into a power play. "We need to know what we're dealing with," he said aloud, in a room that hummed with the calibrated coolness of glass and steel. "If this is an internal issue, it could be used in ways that affect our governance." Harsh, careful language to frame suspicion as prudence. Harper, still soft at the edges from sedation and the rawness of feeling grateful to a stranger, bristled at the thought of anything political being threaded through the surgery that had given her a margin of life. In her quieter moments, she found herself thinking of the small envelope and the daisy card as if it were proof that someone had reached out without the expectation of a return. Once, he pushed a clean linen cart past the private wing where she convalesced. She lay with her hand against a blanket, and a sunflower of bulbs in a vase glinted in the window light. Elias glanced in and saw a woman who had been reduced to human, who blinked when the light found her face. He closed the door with the practiced discretion of someone who did not need to be seen. Later, after his shift, he walked by a glass wall that looked into an executive visitor lounge. Harper and a man in a suit moved through the room like chess pieces. Their conversation was about a product line and a merger, another world spinning edge to edge with his own. He stopped in a doorway and watched, the daisy tattoo catching his skin as the hand flexed against the bars of his cart. In the middle of the search, a small gesture broke something open. Harper received an unsigned letter tucked into a file on her bedside table. A child's crayon daisy and the words "Thank you" scrawled with a thick, honest hand. There was no signature, no address, only a faint smudge of flour from a kitchen counter, and the impression of a child's thumb. The card lodged itself in Harper's chest like a pebble. She carried it to Fletcher in the hush of the afternoon, hands crooked around the edges as if to preserve the anonymity inside. "This tells you what?" she asked, not wanting to be clinical about a thing that had made her feel humanly indebted. Fletcher looked at the drawing, then at his list of leads. "It tells me someone wanted no fanfare," he said. "It tells me someone small thought it was enough to draw a flower." Harper's mouth softened. "I want to find them anyway." "You want to find them for reasons that are different," Fletcher said. "You want to thank. You also, I suspect, want to make sure you're not tied to a system that treats people like line items." Harper considered the layers the man had put into words. She thought of the layoffs she had orchestrated 2 years ago, and the people whose names she could not remember at the end of a quarter. She had a living that was cushioned in privilege, And yet, the surgery had shoved her into rooms where human hands signed off on life, and where people like Elias, quiet, efficient, uncelebrated, could make a choice that upended the ledger. Meanwhile, Beckett Rowe found an opening in the way the public liked simple narratives. It could be a publicity stunt, he suggested to a reporter who ate the crumbs of rumor for breakfast. It could be an insider favor. The insinuation was precise because it poisoned slowly. At home, Elias sat at the kitchen table and smoothed Mia's daisy drawing again. He worried about what would happen if his donation was traced back to him. He had seen men lose their jobs over rumors that had begun as whispers. The janitorial staff relied on the hospital's night shift pay. Their union protections were thin at the edges. If his act of saving a life meant losing the job that kept Mia's daycare paid, he would be no good to her at all. He kept that calculation in his pocket like a stone, so he could feel its weight every time he bent to pick up a spilled cereal bowl. He told himself the truth in the small ways that parents tell truths to themselves, that Mia's life was the axis of all his choices, that Chloe would have done the same without a second's hesitation. He also told himself, not out loud, but in the small language of memory, that the daisy had always been more than a flower. It meant that some promises in life were not measured by bank accounts or headlines. They were kept in the dark hours, in soup passed through a neighbor's door, in a hand pressed against a child's forehead until fever came down. The city continued to spin with the indifference of systems. In boardrooms, decisions were argued over with terms that made human choices sound like calculus: risk mitigation, brand stewardship, stakeholder alignment. Beckett pushed for an internal review, a series of policy changes that would transform anonymous employee generosity into a compliance task. "We can't afford uncertainty," he said. "We need clarity to maintain trust." Harper sat at the head of the table, her recovery still setting the contours of her voice. The idea of converting human grace into protocols made something inside her bristle. After a late-night filing, Elias sat on his stoop and watched Mia trace daisies in flour on the floor like a game. The little marks dissolved when she clapped her hands and moved on to a story about a princess who liked peanut butter. Elias hummed a tune Chloe had once loved, and let the night hold both the sorrow and the small relief that comes after a crisis has passed. He had not told anyone about the match. He had not told Mrs. Gable or even the manager on staff. Anonymity had felt like the proper shape for the act. It had been how Chloe would have wanted it, he believed. But now, with news narrowing and questions rising like storm tide, the secret pressed at the seams of the life he tried to keep modest and steady. The hospital hummed on. The drawer under Harper's bedside table contained cards with small scribbles, each one a tiny evidence of how life could connect. Harper, in the soft time between visitors, fingered the daisy card and felt something unfamiliar, an ache that was not physical but moral, a sense that her life had been extended by someone whose name she did not know and whose story she could not imagine, with generosity without obligation. She decided, finally, and with an odd sort of defiance, that she would look for the donor, not to trade power for gratitude, but to return a favor in a way that could change more than one life. She wanted to build a way for that person and people like them to have stability, not anonymity. Beckett watched Harper's concern for process and optics with an eagle's attention. "If we make a foundation," he suggested, "we can control the narrative. We can show compassion and preserve brand." In his voice were the smooth stones of calculation. Harper, newly sensitive to the human cost of decisions, resisted the shaped box of PR. She wanted something that matched the gut-level goodness of an anonymous hand, as best she could, without imposing the machinery of charity that filtered kindness into spectacle. The discovery ached its way forward like a slow wave. Fletcher's quiet work found a pattern not by accident but by patience. A janitor's name, a recent medical leave, a faint thumbprint of winter soup on a child's drawing left in a patient's room. He came to a modest building on the east side with an address that matched a small apartment and a stoop that had a faded paint line. He rang once, and Elias opened with the natural wariness of someone who had learned that life's smallest things, a knock on the door, a knock on the heart, could be dangerous. Fletcher stood in the light and looked at Elias for the space of a conversation. He did not start with gratitude or with fawning. "Harper Conincade would like to meet you," he said. Elias's hand went instinctively to his sleeve, past the faded daisy tattoo, and tightened on the fabric as if on a rope. Elias considered the offer with a careful mind. A meeting meant exposure. It meant that the quiet benevolence that wrapped his days could be unwrapped and examined under the light. It meant potential loss of job security, of the small privileges he had built to keep Mia safe. He suspected Beckett would turn the moment into a spectacle. He also felt the tug of curiosity, and not merely the curiosity of a man who had saved a life, but of a man who had, by an act of ordinary courage, been given a glimpse into a life that had been shielded by glass and decisions he had never had to make. He thought of Chloe's laugh, the way she had tended daisies in a cheap pot on their fire escape, laughing when the city wind overturned the stem. He thought of Mia's small hand pressing crayon to paper. He thought, finally, of gratitude in a shape not dictated by the terms of others. Elias nodded. "I'll meet her," he said. "But it'll have to be where my daughter will be safe." His voice was measured and full of the small steadiness that had been sharpened by nights and by the thinness of their margins. Fletcher asked where. Elias named the park, where the swings were at the center, and where, on a good weather day, Mia could play under watchful trees, and the eyes of neighbors like Mrs. Gable. It felt right, a public place that was private enough for a father to bring his child, ordinary enough for nobody to expect spectacle. Fletcher wrote down the details, and, when he left, he gave Elias a card and a look that said caution and respect in equal measure. That meeting promised to be the hinge upon which the next actuations of courage and consequence would swing. In the boardroom, Beckett was already assembling narratives in neat rows. He would not be content to let the moment remain unscripted. Harper, who had felt the gravity of anonymity corrode the edges of her assumptions, prepared without spectacle. Elias folded Mia's drawing into his jacket like a secret and watched the city move around them with indifferent speed. When the day of the meeting arrived, the park smelled like cut grass and the kind of sunlight that makes colors honest. Harper approached in the company of a man whose suit fit like armor against scrutiny, an assistant whose quiet competence made him easy to ignore. Fletcher lingered nearby. Elias arrived with Mia, who ran to the swings the way children run to joy, bare knees catching the day. They made a tableau of the ordinary and the extraordinary. A child who had almost lost breath, a father who had risked his own, and a woman whose life had been reset without knowledge of the hands that had done it. Elias had rehearsed nothing. He had kept his dignity the way he kept bills paid, with small, stubborn acts. Harper approached, and for the first beat of their conversation, they stood with the daisy card between them like an amulet, the city noise braided into their hearing. Harper's voice was low, not the corporate command it had been in hearings and shareholder calls, but human and small. "I don't know if you want anything from you," she said. "I just wanted to say thank you." Elias looked at the woman before him and saw a strangeness he had not expected. Vulnerability held in the same steady light he had learned to keep for Mia. He thought first of his daughter, of the small body he would there protect at all costs. He thought also of Chloe, who had taught him that gratitude could be quiet and unadorned. Elias folded his hands and held the center of the moment with that precise kind of restraint. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said. "I did it because I was there when someone needed help. That's what we do." He did not say the thing that might have sounded like sermon, that giving is its own reward. He said it as if he were describing a weather pattern, something inevitable and necessary. Harper listened, and in her face was the slow shift of someone learning a new geometry. She shifted her wallet gently in her hand, an awkward attempt at offering something that did not feel like charity. "I want to help you," she said finally. "Not to make a story, not for PR. I want to make sure you and Mia are secure." Elias felt the offer as if it were another kind of weather. He thought of the trap of gratitude that solidified into obligation or publicity. He thought of the danger of being uplifted in ways that turned a life into a campaign. He wanted safety for Mia more than anything. He wanted, in a small and stubborn way, the dignity of a job, and the ability not to owe more than what he'd given. "I'll think about it," he said. And in that answer was the measured pause of someone who had had to make every choice count. A hush fell between them like a held breath. Around them, other people moved through the park with their own small dramas. A couple arguing gently over ice cream, a dog straining on a leash. The daisies in a neighbor's window box nodded in the breeze like little witnesses. But the world beyond the park would not stop. Beckett's ability to translate human kindness into leverage had not been silent. He had begun to set in motion policy proposals that would shape what Harper's help could look like. He claimed that a foundation would be transparent and measurable, and, in the chords of his voice, the thinness of calculation sang through. Harper had to decide not only how to help Elias and Mia without spectacle, but also how to resist the machinery that would turn their lives into headlines. The choices were no longer personal only. They would ripple outward toward boardrooms and toward hospital policies, toward the lives of janitors and the dignity of families who did not keep their acts of courage in the bright lights that made reputations. The daisy card lay in Harper's palm, the wax crayon smudged. She folded it and kept it like a small map to navigate the kind of help she wanted to become, one that protected without patronizing, that built stability instead of spectacle. The hinge had turned. The coming days would test each person's sense of what generosity could look like when power met discretion, when the anonymous courage of a single father and the institutional muscle of a CEO found a place to negotiate dignity. The city breathed around them, and the next moves would be made in rooms where decisions were felt like pressure and also, sometimes, like possibility. Harper returned to the office carrying the Daisy card in the same pocket where she kept the smallest compromises. An unpaid invoice, a note with a number she had to call, the token of a handshake that had once meant something. The city had not softened for her. The elevators still smelled faintly of lemon and paper. The windows still reflected ambition in glass. But the card sat between receipts and appointment reminders like a quiet insistence. Beckett met her in the conference room with the ease of a man who had already rehearsed the applause. He had lined up 2 reporters for the afternoon. Their emails blinked on his tablet like small, obedient lights. "We can control the narrative," he said, as if those words were a plan rather than a performance. "We create a foundation, a grant. We measure outcomes. We show the before and after." Harper laid the daisy on the table and did not smile. The flower looked childish against their polished wood, and that was its strength. "This was hand-drawn by a little girl," she said. "It is not a logo." Beckett chuckled. "Everything is a logo if you have the right campaign." "You want headlines," Harper said.
Você está no meio de uma frase, pensamento, mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental.
In the end, the motion passed by the narrow width of a conscience that had been persuaded by the image of a child drawing a daisy. Beckett called the reporter. He could not wholly be denied his stage. What Harper had bought was a condition. No photos of the family, no names without consent, a pledge of privacy. It was imperfect, and she knew it, but it was an architecture of restraint that might hold. Elias learned of the foundation in a different register, through a hospital social worker who arrived at his bedside with a clipboard and the soft rhythm of someone who had seen the same grief rewritten into resilience more times than she wanted. She explained the process, the forms, the timelines. She also tied him to a contact at a community center that offered job placements and legal advice in small, unwavering ways. He listened with the practiced economy of a man who had once balanced rent with a child's cough. The idea of charity made him uneasy. He had never wanted to be the recipient of pity. But the social worker did not frame the fund as pity. She framed it as a resource, a bridge. "There are families," she said, "who prefer to be anonymous. There are employers who will treat you like a colleague, not a case file. You can choose how this sits in your life." Chloe arrived at the hospital with flowers stolen from a neighbor's balcony, a modest bouquet that somehow looked like an offering without fuss. She moved around Elias like someone who had promised to hold him steady. She had known for a long time how to speak the language of small mercies. Bring soup, sit for an hour, say nothing when the silence needed keeping. She did not offer speeches. She listened. "You did what you had to," she said when Elias gathered the story, in fragments, about the stairwell, the call, the smell of dust, and the sudden collapsing world. She said it like a fact, not an accolade. Elias wanted to say he owed nothing, that a life was simply life. Instead, he said, it was one moment. Chloe's hand found his, and for the first time since the accident, Elias let the idea of help feel like a map instead of a net. "Then let that moment make a map," she said. "Let it be the thing that keeps you from falling again."
Outside, Beckett's press assurance was already slipping. A junior reporter who had been promised a splash grew impatient and tweeted a hint. Board considering major philanthropic move after downtown rescue. The line was small, but it was a fissure. Within hours, the story exploded with a life of its own. Someone from a rival firm called to ask if the company would partner. A local TV producer wanted to run a segment on corporate heroes. The hospital received calls from well-meaning strangers asking to help, offering anything from bedsheets to months of paid therapy. Harper felt each incoming message as if it were a small stone thrown at a window.
Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era "As if it were a small stone thrown at a window". Você está no meio de uma frase-pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. She moved to contain it, the way one might shield a child from a sudden gust. Tweet back that privacy was requested. Send a legal memo. Call Beckett and ask him to retract, to delay. He promised containment with the same confidence he had promised headlines. But containment requires trust, and Beckett's muscles were flexed toward an outcome that would make him look decisive. By dusk, Elias had been discharged with a plan that included physiotherapy and a check-in from the center's counselor. Mia slept at home with Chloe, while Elias took the first cautious steps into a life that would be both the same and irreconcilably altered. He kept the Daisy card folded inside his wallet, next to a receipt for medicine. It was a small amulet of a day that had broken everything open. Harper, meanwhile, drafted the first grant in the quiet of her Germain office, insisting that the language be simple and the application short. She insisted also on one clause that made some on the legal team wince. Recipients would have the right to decline any form of publicity at any stage for any reason. That clause was the hinge she would use to hold off spectacle. But policy moves in public and private channels alike, and Beckett had allies who liked the idea of a visible program because visibility made the company's stock speak in a better tone. An analyst called to ask how this would affect brand image. An investor wanted assurance that philanthropy would not become a distraction. The conversation threaded the city's arteries like a slow, insistent current. Every act of generosity potentially a lever of influence. Harper took the Daisy card out once more that evening and held it up to the light. She thought of Elias on the stoop with Mia in his arms, the way his face had tightened into that precise restraint she recognized. She thought of Chloe and the way she had come with flowers no one would see. She thought of the boardroom and the shape of power when it chose to be careful instead of loud. She made 2 calls. One was to the social worker, to fast-track the support channels for Elias and for the building's other workers who might be living on the thin edge of catastrophe. The other was to a woman in the communications department, whose job title was modest and whose instincts were not. Harper asked her to prepare a statement that would be firm: privacy respected, funds available, partnership with community organizations. She told the communications head to be ready to say nothing more. Morning arrived with an uneasy truce. For a few hours, the city breathed as if nothing more would happen. Then a local pundit with a penchant for spectacle published an op-ed arguing that corporate philanthropy should be bold and visible, that only public accountability could ensure justice. The piece quoted an unnamed source, a phrase that meant someone had fed it a line. And within minutes, the story had again veered toward performance. Harper could have leaned into the gust and allowed the foundation to become a marquee. She could have let Beckett marshal the optics. Instead, she drove to the community center to sit with the people who would administer the grants. They met in a room lined with children's drawings and donated chairs. The center director, a woman named Rosa, wore a cardigan with a hole in one sleeve and moved paper clips with the practiced economy of someone who stretched resources like elastic. "We take the long view," Rosa said. "We get the bills paid. We negotiate with landlords. We find employers who respect people's hours. We help parents connect to therapists on sliding scales. We do it without cameras." Harper listened and learned. She realized that what she had to offer was not only money, but access to systems that refused to see certain workers as anonymous. She also understood the fragility. Money thrown in without trust could create dependency or exposure. "We want to build a fund that people can use without being used," she said. "We want to make it permanent but quiet." Rosa nodded. "Then give us resources and the authority to decide. Include a clause for anonymous recipients. Put a deadline on any public announcement. If you let us lead, we can protect people while they heal." Harper agreed and left with a list of names, needs, and quiet procedures. She also left with a sense that the real work would not be in boardrooms, but in conversations like this, where the dignity of aid was planned with people who had spent their lives preserving other people's dignity. Back at the hospital, Elias found a letter in his mailbox that morning. Not a press release, not a foundational brochure, but an unsigned check with an envelope that had no return address. Inside was a note, "For Mia." It was anonymous, brief, and folded with the care of someone who knew the precariousness of gratitude. He sat with the check in his hands, feeling the tug between pride and survival. He could deposit it. He could refuse. He folded the note and put it in the pocket where the daisy card had been, and for the first time since the stairwell fell away, he allowed himself to imagine a future that did not have to be defended like a fortress. Yet the city kept spinning new demands. Beckett, sensing a narrowness that could become a weakness, scheduled a donors' breakfast to announce the company's commitment. Harper learned of it as the elevator doors closed on her floor. The invitation was polite, the intent unmistakable. She considered canceling him outright. She considered resigning in the way people sometimes consider dramatic exits, an act that would make a point. Instead, she wrote a one-page memo. Harper stood to speak and kept her voice the exact decibel of ordinary conversation. She told them about Mia and Elias without asking for pity. She cited Rosa's protocols and the anonymous clause. She asked donors to commit to long-term support for worker safety and stable scheduling, to underwrite programs that raised wages and that treated maintenance staff as essential, not expendable. A murmuring followed. Not the admiration Beckett had wanted, not the scorn he feared, but the vital, awkward sound of systems encountering ethics. Some donors nodded. A few hardened. One or two left the room to take calls. Beckett's expression shifted from confident to tactical. When the breakfast broke into smaller conversations, a young reporter edged close to the janitors standing by the door. She had a notepad and an earnest question. "Do you want your stories told?"
The men looked at one another, then at the doors, where the hotel's glass would reflect their faces. One of them, a man named Jorge, who had worked nights for 12 years, shrugged and said, "We want the work. We want the hours. We don't want our kids sold to a camera." Harper overheard and felt something like relief. It was a small vindication of the cause she had fought for. Not a triumph, but a necessary margin of dignity. But the morning's tenuous order had its own gravity. A photograph leaked anyway, not of a family being led to applause, but of a nameless bidder shaking hands with Beckett in a light that made his mouth look decisive. Someone had placed the shot on a feed that thrummed with attention. The headline read, "Corporate Leadership Steps In After Downtown Rescue." Elias would read that headline later, between training modules. He would see his name nowhere. He would see his city reshaping the rescue into a brand. Harper, watching the spill unfold, understood then that the moral architecture she had begun to build would need constant tending. She also understood that she would have to stand in rooms where power sought spectacle and make the case for restraint again and again. The daisy card in Elias's wallet and the anonymous check in his pocket were small victories. The unfolding headlines were tests yet to be met. She took her phone and called Elias. He answered on the second ring. She said simply, "How was your first day?" and listened as he found the words to tell her about a night shift in which he would learn to lead, and about a small boy's laugh down a corridor that somehow sounded like a bell. When they hung up, the city outside had not settled its account with kindness or with publicity. It was only beginning to. The ripple had not yet reached the deeper pools, where rules were made and wages set. There would be meetings and memos and the slow work of shifting schedules and bargaining contracts. There would also be photographers who love stories with faces. Harper folded the memo that Beckett could not break and placed it in her drawer. She would have to return to the board. She would have to guard the anonymity clause with the narrow faith of someone who believes structures can change. She would have to keep saying no to spectacle. For Elias, the next shift would mean a steady paycheck and the bruised comfort of routine. For Mia, it meant more therapy and the slow relearning of ordinary movements. For Chloe, it meant tending small mercies. For Beckett, it meant renegotiating the scale at which his appetite met restraint. The city, meanwhile, carried both the weight of what had happened and the promise of what might be done differently. And in a drawer, where she kept documents that bore the smell of coffee and will, Harper pinned a small piece of wax crayon between two pages. The daisy, folded like a compass. She would look at it before she entered rooms where influence and humility crossed paths, and she would remind herself that some help must be quiet enough to preserve the people it intends to save. Outside the hotel, the janitors dispersed into the day. Jorge walked toward a bus stop with his uniform bag slung over his shoulder. He did not yet know whether the changes promised would change his hours or his life. He only knew he could not be photographed without his consent. That, for now, was enough. Across town, Beckett drafted the narrative he wanted, and Harper redrafted the terms by which people could accept aid without becoming commodities. Somewhere between the two drafts, the future would be written. Messy,
slow, contingent on people who refused either the glare or the silence. And for Elias, who would sleep that night under a ceiling that had once seemed suddenly traitorous and was now slowly a place to rest, the daisy card was a new kind of map. It did not tell him where to go. It only reminded him that someone, not everyone or anywhere, but here and now, had seen him and chosen to help without asking that his life be turned into a story. Outside the hotel, the janitors dispersed into the day. Jorge walked toward a bus stop with his uniform bag slung over his shoulder. He did not yet know whether the changes promised would change his hours or his life. He only knew he could not be photographed without his consent. That, for now, was enough. Across town, Beckett drafted the narrative he wanted, and Harper redrafted the terms by which people could accept aid without becoming commodities. Somewhere between the two drafts, the future would be written. Messy, slow, contingent on people who refused either the glare or the silence. And for Elias, who would sleep that night under a ceiling that had once seemed suddenly traitorous and was now slowly a place to rest, the daisy card was a new kind of map. It did not tell him where to go. It only reminded him that someone, not everyone or anywhere, but here and now, had seen him and chosen to help without asking that his life be turned into a story. The next pressure point was coming, a city hearing proposed by local council members who wanted to study corporate philanthropy in light of the rescue. It promised hearings, testimonies, and the kind of procedural light that could burn fragile things. Harper received notice that afternoon. The city wanted witnesses. Elias received a letter, too, asking if he would testify about the rescue. He looked at the envelope and then at Mia, asleep with a bandage on her tiny knee. He turned the letter over in his hands as if it were something fragile. He could go and tell his truth, risk his privacy for a broader change. Or he could decline and let others narrate his life. He folded the letter back into its envelope. He made a decision that would test the small architecture Harper had installed. He would go, but he would set the terms. He would not speak to cameras without counsel. He would insist on anonymity for his family when possible.